Sleet moves sideways on Hennis Pass. It does not fall. It travels, fine as sand, sharp as ground glass, ticking against iron wheel tires and bare granite, with a sound like 1,000 small clocks running out. The road narrows to a ledge between a rock wall and a 90-foot drop into timber. A woman crouches beside a dead horse in the traces, cutting harness leather with a knife. Her hands are wrapped in cloth that has gone pink. Behind her, a canvas-topped coach sits broadside to the wind, and behind that, a crack in the granite was narrow, dark, and perfectly still. The granite bend above Milton Creek had no name on any map drawn in 1872. Teamsters called it the Elbow. Stage drivers called it worse. It sat 3,000 feet above the Middle Yuba watershed on the old Hennis Pass Road, at a point where the track narrowed between a wall of speckled diorite on the east side and a drop of 90 feet into timber on the west. In good weather, the Elbow was a slow corner. In November, with sleet blowing horizontal and the roadbed turning to grease under iron tires, it was the place where trips ended. Ragna Tveit reached it on the afternoon of November 9th with a canvas-topped mud wagon, 2 horses she did not own, a cracked axle brace she had not noticed until that morning, and her 14-year-old sister Eli coughing under buffalo robes in the coach bed. She owed $32 to a man named Orrin Vale for the cargo lashed behind the driver's box. She had 17 miles of exposed mountain road between her and the next reliable station, and the sleet had not stopped in 6 hours. The horses died within 40 seconds of each other. The bay mare stepped wrong on a granite seam slicked with ice, and her right foreleg folded sideways with a sound like a branch snapping inside a wet cloth. She screamed and went down in the traces. The gelding lunged forward, tangled in the pole straps, and the leather throat latch caught him across the windpipe as the mare's weight dragged the pole sideways. He thrashed, kicked the splinter bar loose, and strangled against the crossbar before Ragna could cut him free. By the time she reached him with the hand axe, his eyes had gone flat. Eli heard it all from inside the coach. She tried to sit up. Her forehead was hot enough that Ragna could feel it through the buffalo robe when she pressed her hand there. Ragna stood in the sleet beside 2 dead animals and did the arithmetic that would define the next 60 days of her life. She had no team. She had no way to move the coach forward or backward on a road too narrow to turn. She had 40 feet of hemp line, 1 hand axe, 1 shovel, a bent tire iron, 3 oil lamps, 2 gallons of kerosene, 6 pounds of flour, enough beans for 12 days if she stretched them, a sack of dried apples already going soft, 1 wool blanket for each of them, the 2 buffalo robes Eli was wrapped in, a tin thermometer, and a Bible in waxed cloth that her mother had packed in Christiania 4 years ago. The nearest station with a standing roof was 17 miles away, and her sister could not walk 17 feet without her knees buckling. She could not leave. Vale owned the cargo underlying. If she abandoned it, she forfeited wages, reputation, and the supplies inside. If she stayed, she had no shelter beyond a wooden box on wheels sitting broadside to a Sierra pass that funneled wind like a bellows. That was the math. 2 dead horses, 1 sick girl, $32 owed, 17 miles of nothing, and winter settling onto the granite like something patient and permanent. The first person to reach Ragna was not a rescuer. He was a debt collector. Matthew Voss arrived the following morning with 2 men and a pack mule, following the Hennis Pass Road down from the Weber Lake relay. Voss was 58 years old. He had spent 11 years building snow sheds for the Central Pacific Railroad before his left knee gave out on a scaffold above Donner Summit. Now he kept the Upper Hennis Pass Station, maintained the road markers between the summit and Camptonville, and collected mail from wrecked or abandoned stages on behalf of the California Stage Company. His face looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the pass. Deep lines, wind-scoured skin, and pale eyes that measured everything and approved of nothing. He had not come for Ragna. He had come for the mail pouch. Voss dismounted at the elbow and studied the scene, the way a man studies a fallen tree blocking his path, not with sympathy, but with calculation. 2 dead horses. 1 damaged mud wagon sitting crosswise to the wind. Canvas snapping loose at the rear quarter. A girl, because that was what Ragna looked like to him. A girl crouching beside the near horse with a knife, cutting harness leather into strips. He watched her hands. She was not hacking. She was following the stitching lines, preserving the long traces while removing the buckle plates. She stacked the hardware in a pile sorted by size. She coiled the traces without kinking them. Voss noticed this. He dismissed it anyway. He stepped around the dead gelding and spoke without greeting. "Where is the mail?" Ragna pointed to the coach bed without looking up. "Under the seatboard, in the iron box. The lock is frozen. You will need to warm it." Voss sent one of his men to retrieve it. Then he walked the length of the coach, pressing his hand against each panel, kicking the wheels, testing the axle with his boot heel. He found the cracked brace and shook his head. He looked at the canvas roof, already sagging where sleet had pooled and frozen. He looked at the granite wall rising behind the coach. He looked at the sky. "You have a dead team," Voss said. He was not speaking to Ragna. He was speaking to the situation, the way a doctor speaks to a chart. "You have a broken pole. You have canvas for a roof and granite that will throw wind straight through your ribs. Your sister has a fever, and you have no quinine. The best thing you can do is strip whatever you can carry, put the girl on my mule, and walk to the line shack below the summit. I can leave you flour and a tinderbox." Ragna kept cutting leather. "Which line shack?" Voss paused. The pause said everything. The line shack roof had collapsed in October. He knew it, and she knew it. "The walls still stand," he said. "The walls stand, and the roof does not. That is a corral, not a shelter." Voss's jaw tightened. He was not accustomed to being corrected by someone half his age with dead horses and no options. "You cannot stay here. This coach will be matchwood by the first gale. I have seen it happen. A broadside wagon on an exposed grade lasts 1 storm. Sometimes 2 if the wind cannot decide which direction to kill it from." Ragna set down the knife. She looked at Voss for the first time. She had her mother's coloring. Fair, sharp-boned, with eyes the color of creek water over granite, and her father's hands, which were too large for her frame and rougher than any 23-year-old woman's hands had a right to be. "That coach is a coffin once the gale finds it," Voss said. He meant it as a verdict. Ragna held his gaze. "Only if the gale can get inside." Voss stared at her. Then he shook his head, collected the mail pouch, and mounted his mule. He left the flour and the tinderbox. He did not leave the quinine. As his men disappeared around the bend below the elbow, Ragna heard one of them laugh. The sound carried in the cold air like a stone skipping across ice. She went back to the harness. There was a lot of leather to cut. The idea did not arrive whole. It arrived in pieces, the way her father's lessons always had, scattered across years, waiting for the moment they would matter. The first piece was failure. On the morning of the second day, Ragna tried the obvious. She cut 2 young firs with the hand axe, stripped them, and rigged a canvas lean-to between the trees and the coach body. She used hemp line for the ridgepole lashing and staked the canvas at 3 points with tire iron pins driven into frozen ground. It took 4 hours. Her palm split on the axe handle. She wrapped them with strips Eli tore from her petticoat hem, and the cloth turned pink before Ragna finished the last stake. The wind pulled the first stake free at dusk. It did not gust. It simply leaned against the canvas with a steady, patient weight, the way a man leans against a door he intends to open. The ridgepole bowed. The canvas bellied inward. Then the second fir pole snapped against the coach body with a crack that made Eli cry out from inside. Ragna crawled under the coach to retrieve the stake. The ground was frozen hard enough to ring under her knuckles. She reached between the rear wheels and felt for the iron pin in the dark, and then she felt something else. Behind the coach, where the granite wall curved inward and formed a V-shaped notch in the rock face, the air was different. Not warm, but still. The wind that had been shoving the canvas and rattling the coach panels and driving sleet into every gap it could find, that wind did not exist 6 feet inside the notch. Snow had piled at the mouth in a drift, but the drift tapered to nothing deeper in. The granite walls narrowed from roughly 7 feet apart at the opening to just over 5 feet at the throat, and the rock itself rose 15 feet on each side before closing to a crack overhead. Ragna pressed her palm flat against the granite. It was cold. Of course it was cold, but it was not the same cold as the air. The rock had a density to it, a slowness, as if the cold had to work harder to move through it. Her father's voice came back to her then, not as a memory she chose to recall, but as a sensation, his rough hand pressing against the wall of the stone dairy in Telemark, his breath visible in the lantern light. His words measured the way he measured everything. Wood keeps wind out, Ragna. Stone keeps yesterday. She had been 7 years old. She had not understood. She understood now. Ragna backed out from under the coach and lit one of the oil lamps. She carried it to the mouth of the cleft and held it at arm's length. The flame leaned sideways, pushed flat by the wind channeling along the granite face. She stepped 2 feet inside the notch. The flame straightened slightly. She stepped 4 feet inside. The flame stood nearly vertical, flickering only at the tip. At 6 feet, where the walls narrowed to their throat, the flame burned straight and steady, and the smoke rose in a clean column instead of shredding into nothing. She held the tin thermometer against the granite at the 6-foot mark and watched. Outside, the reading had been 14 degrees that afternoon. Here, against the rock, the mercury sat at 23. 9 degrees warmer, and the rock was doing nothing but existing. Ragna looked at the coach. She looked at the cleft. She measured with her eyes. The coach body, stripped of the outer running boards, the damaged side rail, and the front pole, was roughly 5 feet across. The cleft throat was 5 feet 3 inches at its narrowest, widening to 7 at the mouth. The coach was 8 feet 6 inches long. The cleft ran at least 12 feet deep before the walls closed too tight for use. It would fit. If she removed the front assembly, stripped the running gear on the left side, and dragged the coach backward into the notch using the rear axle as a guide rail, the wooden body would wedge into the granite V like a cork in a bottle. The stone walls would block wind from both sides. The narrowing rock overhead would deflect snow. The coach roof, even damaged canvas, would only need to seal the gap between the coach top and the rock above, a space of perhaps 2 feet instead of open sky. And inside that sealed pocket, every degree of heat, from a lamp, from a body, from breath itself, would stay, because the granite would not give it back quickly, because stone keeps yesterday. The risk was absolute. If the coach jammed crooked going in, it would block the cleft and could not be moved again. If the mud she used to seal the edges froze before bonding to the rock, the wind would peel it out like bark. If the axle broke during the drag, The coach became useless lumber in a place where lumber without a saw meant nothing, and she would have to do it alone, with cut hands, with a sick sister, with no horses, no block and tackle, no crew. Ragna looked at the notch. She looked at the coach. She looked at the sky, which had gone the color of iron and was not going to change. She picked up the hand axe and started removing the front pole. Clara Baines arrived with Voss's salvage crew on the third day, though arrived overstated what happened. Clara had been traveling south from the Weber Lake station with her nephew when Voss's men caught up to them on the road. She was 31, a widow whose husband had died building a bridge footing on the Downeyville Road when a green timber kicked loose from a gin pole and caught him across the temple. She knew wood. She knew joints. She knew the difference between what held and what looked like it held. She found Ragna on her knees behind the coach, packing moss into a hand-width crack between granite and the coach's rear panel. The front pole was off. The single tree pins sat in a neat row on a flat rock. One running board leaned against the granite, already repurposed as a work platform. Clara watched for a minute. Then she said, "The coach will rot." Ragna did not look up. "Not before spring. Smoke will choke you. Not if I vent it. Mud will freeze before it seals." Ragna stopped. She sat back on her heels and looked at Clara the way she had looked at Voss, measuring, not pleading. Mud freezes on the surface. Moss underneath holds the gap. Stone on top holds the moss. Wind cannot peel what it cannot reach. Clara frowned. This was not the answer of a woman guessing. How do you pull a dead coach without horses? That thing weighs more than a ton. 2,500 pounds with the running gear, maybe 1,800 stripped. I have 40 feet of hemp, 2 full sets of harness traces, a lever, and time. You do not have time. You have days. Then I had better not spend them arguing. Clara looked at the cleft. She looked at the coach. She looked at Ragna's hands, which were wrapped in blood-stained cloth and shaking slightly, not from cold, but from 3 days of continuous axe work. Something shifted behind Clara's eyes. Not belief. Not yet. But the recognition that this woman had thought past the first objection and the second and the third, and was still working. Clara did not help. Not yet. But she did not leave either. The gossip reached Camptonville before the first seal was set. Teamsters talked. Voss's men had seen the dead horses, the stripped coach, and the girl packing moss into rock. By the time the story traveled 17 miles downhill, it had become simpler and stranger. The Norwegian girl was burying a stagecoach in a crack in the mountain. The gossip mattered because of one man, Orrin Vale. Vale was 46 years old, a station lessee who brokered cargo shipments between Sacramento freight companies and the mountain relay stops. He held a lien on the goods in Ragna's coach, flour, kerosene, hardware, and a company lockbox, and he held the $32 debt she owed for the right to haul them. Vale was not a cruel man in the way that frontier stories require cruelty. He was something more dangerous. He was a man who understood leverage. If Ragna succeeded, if she somehow preserved the coach and the cargo through winter, Vale collected his $32 and lost nothing. But if she failed, if the coach splintered or the cargo spoiled, Vale could claim negligence, seize the salvage value, pressure Voss to sign a loss statement, and write Ragna off entirely. Her failure was worth more to him than her success because her failure cost him nothing he had not already written off, and it removed a debtor who had proven difficult about repayment terms. Vale rode up to the elbow on the 5th day with a deputy notary named Ferris and 2 men who worked his lower station. He found Ragna cutting a ruined leather trace into short lashings. The coach sat 10 feet from the cleft mouth. The front pole was gone. One running board was missing. Harness traces lay coiled around a fur lever jammed between two rocks. Vale dismounted and looked at the arrangement the way a man looks at a hand of cards he does not understand. Then he looked at Ragna. "You are dismantling property under lien," he said. Ragna did not stop cutting. "I am preserving property under lien by destroying it." Ragna pointed the knife toward the dead horses. They were half buried in blown snow now, shapeless mounds with brass harness bells still visible on the near mare's collar, frozen silent. That is what happens to property left broadside on this grade. By morning, it will be splinters. By the first gale, it will be kindling scattered across a quarter-mile of timber. Vale stepped closer. He was taller than Ragna by a head, and he used the height. "A coach is built to roll, not hibernate. You are not saving it. You are burying it. I am putting it where the wind cannot reach it. In a crack in a rock." "In a crack in a rock." Vale turned to Ferris. "Note that. She admits it." He turned back. "I want the mail pouch. I want the kerosene. And I want the company lockbox. Voss took the mail pouch 2 days ago. The kerosene stays. Without kerosene, I have no lamp. Without a lamp, my sister dies." "Your sister is not my concern." The words landed in the cold air and stayed there. Ragna stopped cutting. She stood. She was a head shorter than Vale, but she stood close enough that he had to look down at her, which meant he had to see her hands, and her hands were torn and wrapped and still holding the knife. "The kerosene stays," she said. "The lockbox stays until Voss confirms the manifest, and the cargo stays because if it leaves the coach, it will be on the ground in a storm, and you will lose everything instead of nothing." Vale held her gaze for 5 seconds. Then he smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "I will be back when the road opens. If that coach is in pieces, you will answer for every nail." He mounted and turned his horse downhill. Ferris followed. One of Vale's men looked back over his shoulder at Ragna and shook his head slowly, the way men shake their heads at something they have already decided is finished. Eli had heard everything from inside the coach. She had pulled herself to the door and was gripping the frame with both hands, her face flushed and damp. "He will take everything," she whispered. Ragna looked at her sister. She looked at the cleft. She looked at the snow blowing under the coach door in thin white lines that crawled across the floor like fingers. "Not if there's nothing left to take," she said. "Not if the coach is inside the rock." Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who did not understand what you were trying to build? The work began that afternoon, and it did not stop. Ragna's plan required moving 1,800 pounds of stripped coach backward across 10 feet of frozen ground and into a granite throat barely wide enough to accept it. She had no horses. She had no block and tackle. She had cut hands, a hemp line, harness traces, a fur lever, and the kind of stubbornness that comes from having already lost every other option. The first step was the anchor. She dragged the broken front pole, 8 feet of oak, cracked but whole, and laid it crosswise behind 2 granite boulders near the cleft mouth. She packed snow around it, scooped water from a seep that still ran beneath the ice crust, and soaked the packed snow until it froze around the pole in a solid block. By morning, the pole would not move. Ragna had learned this from watching ice fishermen on the Mjøsa in Norway. Wet snow freezes harder than dry snow, and a buried timber in frozen ground holds like iron set in mortar. The second step was the windlass. She looped paired harness traces, each one 12 feet of braided leather, rated to hold a horse at full pull around the fur lever. She ran the traces from the buried anchor pole to the coach's rear axle, wrapping twice around the hub for grip. The principle was simple. Twist the lever. The traces shorten. The coach moves. Chock the wheels. Reset. Twist again. The principle was simple. The execution was brutal. On the first turn of the lever, the traces creaked and the coach groaned. The rear wheels rocked in their ruts. Ragna threw her weight against the fur bar, all 126 pounds of hurrah, and the coach moved. 2 inches. She heard it in the scrape of iron tire on frozen granite. She marked the wheel position with a charcoal line on the rock. She chalked the wheels with stones, reset the traces, twisted again, 2 more inches. In 6 hours, she moved the coach 14 inches. Her shoulders shook with each turn. The hemp line abraded through the first layer of wrapping on her palms, and the blood came fresh. Eli tore more strips from her petticoat and handed them out through the coach door without speaking. There was nothing to say. The numbers said everything. 14 inches in 6 hours. 10 feet to go. Roughly 50 more cycles. At dusk, one of the harness traces snapped. The leather parted with a sound like a whip crack, and the loose end lashed across Ragna's cheek, hard enough to open the skin. She sat down on the frozen ground with her hand pressed to her face and blood running between her fingers, and for the first time since the horses died, she cried. Not loudly, not for long. But the tears came, and they froze on her skin before they reached her jaw. Eli said from inside the coach, "How far?" Ragna wiped her face. She looked at the charcoal marks on the granite. 14 inches, a distance a child could step across without trying. "Far enough to keep going," she said. She spliced the broken trace with a double fisherman's knot, a knot her father had taught her for joining lines on a gill net, a knot that held better under load than the original leather esanam, and reset the windlass. She would work through the night, not because she was brave, but because the sky had turned the color of a bruise and the wind had shifted north, and she knew what a north wind on Hennis Pass meant. It meant the days she had were fewer than the days she needed. The temperature dropped to 11 degrees by midnight. Ragna kept turning the lever. The charcoal marks crept along the granite in the lamplight like the hours on a clock that only moved when she moved it. 2 inches, 2 inches, 2 inches. Somewhere below the elbow, an owl called once, and did not call again. The silence after it was the kind of silence that has weight, the silence of a mountain deciding what it will do next. Ragna had moved the coach 26 inches by dawn. She had 8 feet and 10 inches to go. She had 5 days before the heavy weather Voss had warned about. She had 1 spliced trace, 2 bleeding hands, and a sister whose fever had climbed high enough to make her whisper names that belonged to people in Norway. The coach sat on the granite like something stubborn and half alive, tilted slightly toward the cleft, its shadow falling across the mouth of the notch where the air was still and the wind had never reached. Ragna stood, pressed her torn palms against her thighs, and picked up the lever. She had work to do. Aslak Moen came out of the timber on the morning of the 4th day, dragging a hand sled loaded with split cedar behind him, like a man pulling his own coffin uphill. Ragna heard him before she saw him. The sled runners scraped against frozen ground with a rhythmic hiss, and between each scrape came the sound of breathing, heavy, measured, the breathing of a man who had been climbing for hours and intended to keep climbing until he reached whatever he was climbing toward. She set down the lever and watched the tree line below the elbow. He emerged from the firs as a silhouette first, tall, thin, bent forward against the grade, with a wool cap pulled low and a beard that had gone white at the chin and stayed dark everywhere else. He was 63 years old. He moved like a man who had spent those years carrying heavy things across uneven ground, and had learned to make the ground do some of the work. On his sled, beneath a canvas cover, lay 8 lengths of split cedar, a coil of iron wire, a mason's pointing trowel wrapped in oilcloth, and a draw knife with a handle worn smooth as river stone. He stopped at the edge of the elbow and looked at the scene. 2 dead horses, now just shapes under snow, a stripped mud wagon sitting 3 feet from the mouth of a granite cleft, harness traces rigged to a fir lever, charcoal marks every 2 inches on the rock face, tracking the coach's movement backward. A young woman with wrapped hands and a cut on her cheek standing beside the lever with her weight on one leg, because the other knee had started swelling 2 days ago. Aslak studied the charcoal marks. He counted them. He looked at the cleft, then at the coach, then at the marks again. "You are not guessing," he said. His accent was Norwegian, thicker than Ragna's, the vowels rounded by a childhood spent in a valley near Bergen, where the dialect still carried Old Norse in its corners. "That is why I will stay until sundown." Ragna did not ask who he was. She did not ask why he had come. She asked the only question that mattered. "Can you help me move it 3 more feet today?" Aslak set down the sled rope. He walked to the windlass, examined the splice trace, tested the anchor pole with his boot, and looked at the angle of pull between the axle and the cleft mouth. Then he shook his head. "Not 3 feet, not this way. Your line is pulling crooked because the anchor sits too far left. Every turn drags the coach sideways as much as backward. You have been fighting the angle for 2 days and did not know it." Ragna stared at the charcoal marks. She had been so focused on the inches that she had not seen the curve. The coach was drifting left with each pull, and if it entered the cleft at an angle, it would jam against the narrowing walls and never seat flush. Aslak was already moving. He dragged one of the granite chocks, a flat stone the size of a man's chest, and placed it against the left rear wheel as a guide rail. Then he repositioned the anchor pole 6 inches to the right, repacking the frozen snow around it with water from the seep. He did not explain what he was doing while he did it. He explained after, when the correction was already made and visible in the new line of the traces. "A windlass does not care about strength," he said, tapping the fir lever. "It cares about angle. You had the strength. You did not have the line." He stayed past sundown. He stayed the next day. He never said he was staying. He simply did not leave. Aslak Moen had been a stonemason in Norway, a railroad laborer in California, and a snowshed repairman on the Central Pacific Line above Emigrant Gap. He had built walls that held back avalanches and walls that collapsed under their own weight. And he said the difference was never the stone. It was always the joint. He taught Ragna 3 things during those days of construction, and he taught them the way her father had taught her, through his hands, not his mouth. The first lesson was the dead man anchor. Ragna had built one, but Aslak rebuilt it. He buried the crosspiece deeper, angled it against the direction of pull, and packed the surrounding snow in layers, wet, frozen, until the block was not sitting in the ground but fused to it. He made Ragna test it by pulling with her full weight on the traces. The pole did not shift. "Wet snow becomes stone if you're patient," he said. "Impatient anchors pull free. Patient anchors hold wagons." The second lesson was windlass multiplication. Ragna had been twisting the lever with brute force, gaining 2 inches per cycle. Aslak added a second wrap of traces around the lever, effectively doubling the mechanical advantage at the cost of having the distance per turn. 1 inch per cycle instead of 2, but each inch required half the effort. "You are spending your body," he told her. "A lever spends rope instead. Rope does not bleed." The third lesson, and the one that would save her life, was stone-keyed chinking. He taught it on the afternoon of the 5th day, when the coach had finally reached the cleft mouth, and Ragna was smearing river mud into the gap between the coach wall and the granite. She was working fast, pressing handfuls of mud into the crack and smoothing it flat the way she would mortar a hearthstone. Aslak watched for 1 minute. Then he pulled a fistful of dried moss from his sled and handed it to her. "Stop," he said. "You're building a wall that will die tonight." Ragna stopped. Mud dripped from her fingers. "Surface mud freezes on the outside and shrinks," Aslak said. He crouched beside the gap and pointed. "Wind finds the shrink crack. Wind enters. Wind peels the rest." He took the moss and pressed it deep into the gap, packing it with his pointing trowel until it filled the space behind where the mud would sit. Then he placed a flat stone, no bigger than his palm, over the moss, pressing it into the crack so the stone's face was flush with the granite wall. Then he pressed mud behind and around the stone, not over it. Moss holds the gap. Stone locks the moss. Mud binds behind. Wind hits stone, not mud. Wind cannot peel what it cannot lift. He made her redo every seal she had already set. It cost her 4 hours. She did it without complaint because she understood the difference between a wall that looked sealed and a wall that was sealed, and she had learned that difference by watching her first attempt crumble under Aslak's thumbnail. The coach entered the cleft on the evening of the 5th day, and it nearly destroyed everything. Ragna and Aslak had been pulling since dawn, 1 inch per cycle, chalking after every 3 cycles, checking the charcoal marks against the alignment stones Aslak had placed at the cleft mouth. The rear of the coach crossed the threshold at midday. The granite walls touched the coach panels on both sides, and the sound changed. The scraping became a low groan as wood pressed against stone. By late afternoon, the rear axle had passed the narrowest point. Ragna removed the right rear wheel to reduce width, greasing the axle hub with tallow and sliding it over flat stones she had placed as a track. The left wheel rolled along the granite floor, which was smoother inside the cleft than outside. The coach crept backward into the V like an animal backing into a den. Then it jammed. The coach body caught at an angle, the right rear corner biting into a granite ridge that jutted 2 inches farther than Ragna had measured. The wood screamed against stone. The left wall buckled inward, 1/2 inch, popping 2 panel nails. The coach stopped, and no amount of lever work would move it. Ragna pulled harder. The traces groaned. The fir lever bent until she could hear the wood fibers separating. "Stop!" Aslak's voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of a man who had watched walls collapse. "Listen." Ragna stopped. In the silence, she heard it. A low creak, not from the traces but from the coach body itself. The granite was pressing against the walls from both sides, and the coach was groaning under compression. If she pulled harder, the body would split. "You cannot force it," Aslak said. "You must lighten it. Take out weight until the frame can flex." Ragna climbed inside. Eli watched from the bunk with fever-bright eyes as Ragna removed the mail trunk, the seatboards, the iron footrail, and the toolbox. She handed each piece out through the door to Aslak, who stacked them in the vestibule space between the cleft mouth and the coach entry. 40 pounds, 60, 90. The coach frame shifted imperceptibly with each piece removed. "Again," Aslak said. Ragna pulled the lever. 1 inch. The right corner cleared the granite ridge with a sound like a knuckle cracking. The coach settled into the cleft throat, and the walls touched the panels on both sides with steady, even pressure, not crushing but holding, the way hands hold a cup. Ragna let go of the lever and sat on the frozen ground. Her arms hung between her knees. Her hands had stopped bleeding that morning, not because they were healing, but because the cold had closed everything down. Aslak sat beside her. He did not speak. They watched the coach, half swallowed by granite, its rear wall 4 feet inside the rock throat, its open front facing the vestibule. Snow fell in the last light, drifting across the elbow, sliding along the granite face, and dying at the cleft mouth where the wind could not follow. "Tomorrow we seal it," Ragna said. "Tomorrow you seal it," Aslak corrected. "I will show you how the vent must draw, then you will know everything you need." That was when Vale returned. He came with 2 men riding up the grade in the last gray light, and he saw the coach from 50 yards away. Or rather, he saw where the coach had been and where it was now. The flat place on the elbow where it had sat broadside was empty, except for charcoal marks and dead horses. The coach itself was visible only as a dark shape inside the rock, its canvas roof still faintly white against the granite. Vale dismounted and walked to the cleft mouth. He stared into it for a long time. Then he turned to Voss's station man, who had accompanied him for the return trip. "It is ruined," Vale said. "She has wedged it into the rock and cracked the frame. I want this documented." Voss's man, a quiet teamster named Harlan, who had worked the Hennis Pass road for 9 years, looked at the coach. He looked at the seals already set along the lower edges. He looked at the charcoal marks tracking every inch of movement. Then he looked at Vale. "The frame is not cracked," Harlan said. "I can see the joints from here. They are compressed, not broken." Vale's face did not change, but something behind his eyes tightened. He turned to Ragna. "This is not preservation. This is burial." Ragna was too tired to argue. Aslak answered for her. "Burial is for the dead. This coach is the only living thing on this grade." Vale left without signing anything. Harlan refused to witness the loss statement. As they rode down, Ragna watched Vale's back and knew he would return again, and that each return would carry more weight than the last. But Voss's man had refused to sign. That was a crack in the wall Vale was building, and cracks, as Aslak had taught her, were where everything started. The ceiling took all of the 6th day. Ragna worked from the bottom up, following Aslak's method: moss first, stone second, mud behind. The lower gaps between the coach floor and the granite were the worst, some as wide as a fist where the rock curved away from the flat coach bottom. She filled these with doubled moss, wedged flat stones into the packing, and sealed the backs with mud mixed from the red clay she had dug from the seat bank and water warmed over the lamp. Aslak taught the vent last. It was the most important lesson, and the one that frightened Ragna most, because it required leaving a gap in the seal she had spent a day building. "A sealed room without breath is a box," Aslak said. He took a tin scrap, cut from the lid of the mail lockbox, and bent it into a shallow curve. He placed it at the top of the upper canvas boot, where the coach roof met the rock overhead. The curve faced outward and upward, creating a narrow channel between the canvas and the stone. He lit a candle and held it near the vent. The flame leaned outward, drawn by the air moving over the curved tin. Smoke from the candle rose, hit the channel, and streamed out through the gap instead of pooling inside. "Wind passing over a curved edge pulls air from behind it," Aslak said. "The faster the wind outside, the harder the draw inside. Your fire will breathe because the storm will breathe for it." He made her test it 3 times. Each time the flame drew outward. Each time the smoke cleared. Then Aslak turned the candle around and held it near the vent from outside. The flame pushed inward, guttering back into the coach. "If you ever see the flame do this," he said, "your vent is wrong. Wind is entering, not leaving. You must reshape the curve or close the vent, and cut a new one lower. Ragna nodded. She understood. She also understood that this single piece of bent tin was the difference between a shelter and a coffin. Aslak left that evening. He did not say goodbye in words. He gripped Ragna's forearm the way Norwegian men grip each other's forearms, hard, brief, honest, and said, "Test before trusting," every time. Then he pulled his sled into the tree line and was gone. The shelter was complete enough to test. Ragna lit one lamp and placed it on the shelf she had built from the mail trunk lid, bracketed to the coach wall at bunk height. She sealed the entry with a hanging buffalo robe weighted at the bottom with stones. Eli lay on the raised bunk, coach seats and mail slats, 2 feet off the frozen floor, wrapped in the second robe. Ragna held the thermometer at arm's length inside the sealed coach. Outside, the air read 12 degrees. She waited. 5 minutes. 10. The mercury climbed. 20, 24, 29. It held at 29 for 10 minutes with no lamp, just the sealed air and 2 bodies and the granite slowly releasing the faint heat it had absorbed from 6 hours of weak November sun. She lit the lamp. The mercury moved again. 35, 40, 43 at the bunk rail. She moved the thermometer closer to the lamp. 51, 58 at the shelf. Ragna wrote the numbers on the coach wall with a carpenter's pencil. 12 outside, 29 sealed, 43 at the bunk, 58 by the lamp. She wrote them the way her father wrote measurements on timber, clear, square, permanent. Not because she trusted the numbers yet, but because she needed to see them outside her own head, proof that the granite was doing what granite does. Eli opened her eyes. The lamplight moved across her face, and for the first time in 6 days, her skin was not gray. "It is warm," she whispered. "It is not warm," Ragna said. "It is less cold. That is different." But she pulled the robe tighter around her sister, and she allowed herself to believe, not fully, not yet, but enough to exhale, that the numbers might hold. Voss came one last time before the sky closed. He arrived at noon on the 7th day, alone, leading his mule. He ducked through the vestibule, pushed the buffalo robe aside, and stepped into the coach cave. He stood there for a long moment, turning slowly, looking at the seals, the vent, the bunk, the lamp shelf. He pressed his palm against the granite wall the way Ragna's father had pressed his palm against the dairy wall in Telemark, and he held it there. 43 degrees, Ragna said, watching him. Voss said nothing for a while. Then he reached into his coat and produced a sealed paper packet. He set it on the bunk beside Eli. "Quinine bark," he said. "For the girl, not for the coach." He turned to leave. At the entry he paused without looking back. "I still think it will fail," he said, "but I cannot tell you how." He left. Ragna watched him go, and understood that Voss not being able to tell her how it would fail was the closest thing to approval a man like Voss would ever give. That evening the sky changed. The clouds did not thicken. They lowered, pressing down on the granite like a hand pressing down on a table. Sound died. The wind stopped. Snow began falling straight down, each flake heavy and slow, landing on the granite face without sound. Ragna had seen this in Norway. Still air before a storm was not peace. It was the mountain holding its breath. She checked every seal. She tested the vent with the candle. The flame drew outward, steady and clean. She fed Eli quinine tea brewed over the lamp. She counted her kerosene, 1 gallon and 3/4 remaining. She counted her food, beans for 8 days, flour for 4, dried apples already eaten. She hung the buffalo robe over the entry, weighted it, and sealed herself inside with her sister, 1 lamp, and a tin thermometer that read 43 degrees in a space the size of a coffin that Voss had promised it would be. Then the wind came. It hit the rock face at midnight with a sound that Ragna had no word for in English or Norwegian, not a howl, not a roar, a compression, as if the entire weight of the sky had leaned against the mountain and the mountain had groaned under it. The granite transmitted the impact through every surface. The coach walls shuddered. The lamp flame jumped and steadied. Ragna felt the sound in her teeth. Snow did not fall. It traveled sideways, a horizontal river of white that screamed past the cleft mouth and piled against the vestibule stones in minutes. The buffalo robe entry jerked inward, caught the wind, and slapped back. Ragna grabbed the weighted hem and pressed it flat. Cold air knifed through the gap and hit her face like water. She sealed the gap with her body first, kneeling against the robe, and with stones second, packing them along the bottom edge until the robe hung still. The temperature inside the coach dropped from 43 to 31 in 4 minutes. Eli pulled the robe to her chin and coughed. Ragna lit the second lamp, 2 flames now burning low, heating the small pocket of air between wooden walls and granite. The mercury climbed back. 34, 37, 40. It would not reach 43 again tonight. The wind outside was stealing heat faster than 2 lamps could make it, but it was not killing them. That was the difference. Outside, the wind was moving at a speed that would strip exposed skin in minutes. Inside, the air was still, cold, but still, and in stillness, a body can warm itself. In wind, it cannot. The first complication came at 2 in the morning. Eli's fever spiked. She had been improving on the quinine, but the temperature crash when the entry seal broke had undone 2 days of progress. She burned. Her skin went dry. She asked for water, and Ragna had no water that was not snow. Melting snow required heat. Heat required fuel. Fuel was kerosene, and kerosene was also light, and light was also warmth. Every choice branched into a cost. Ragna could not heat water without burning kerosene she needed for the lamp she needed for the heat she needed for her sister's fever. She solved it with the mailbox lid. She bent the tin into a shallow dish, filled it with snow, and set it on the lamp shelf behind the glass where the flame's radiant heat was strongest. The snow melted in 9 minutes. She let it cool to drinkable warmth and held the cup to Eli's lips. Eli drank. Her eyes were open but unfocused, watching something Ragna could not see. Ragna set the cup down and checked the vent. The candle flame leaned outward. Good. The draw was working even in a gale. Aslak's curved tin was pulling the smoke out as the wind screamed over the rock above. Then the flame reversed. At 3 in the morning, the wind shifted. It had been blowing west to east across the cleft mouth. Now it swung north and hit the rock face head on, and the pressure found the vent and pushed inward. The candle flame guttered back into the coach. Smoke from both lamps, which had been streaming obediently toward the vent, pooled against the canvas ceiling and began to sink. Eli coughed. Ragna's eyes burned. In 20 seconds, the small space filled with a haze that tasted of kerosene and wool and hot tin. Ragna remembered Aslak's warning. If the flame pushes inward, the vent is wrong. Do not seal it. Reshape it. She grabbed the heated nail from the lamp shelf, a 10-penny nail she kept in the flame for melting snow, and crawled to the lower corner of the vestibule where the stone wall met the coach floor. She pressed the hot nail into the wood and burned a hole the width of her thumbnail through the panel. Cold air rushed in at floor level. The pressure inside the coach equalized. The vent flame reversed again, leaning outward. Smoke lifted from the ceiling and streamed toward the upper channel. In 2 minutes, the air cleared. The lower hole caused her heat. The temperature dropped 3 degrees and held there. But she could breathe, and Eli stopped coughing, and the lamps burned clean. This was the first validation. Not of Ragna's plan alone, but of Aslak's teaching. The vent had failed under conditions he had predicted, and the fix he had described, cut a new draw lower, had worked in the dark, in a gale, with a heated nail, and hands too cold to feel. The second complication came from outside. At 4 a.m, through the shriek of wind and the rattle of sleet against granite, Ragna heard pounding, not the rhythmic pounding of a branch against rock. Human pounding, fists against stone. She pressed her ear to the buffalo robe entry. The sound came from the vestibule. Someone was in the space between the outer stone curtain and the coach entrance, hammering on the rock and shouting words the wind shredded into nothing. Opening the seal meant losing everything. The entry robe was the last barrier between the wind and the warm air pocket. If she pulled it aside, the gale would drive snow into the coach, drop the temperature to ambient, and extinguish both lamps. Eli would lose the 40-degree air that was keeping her fever from becoming something worse. The pounding continued. It weakened. It became slower. Ragna tied the hemp line around her waist and knotted the other end to the coach's rear axle. She told Eli to hold the robe flat against the frame and not let go. Then she lifted the bottom corner of the robe, just the corner, a gap no wider than her shoulders, and pushed through. The wind hit her like a wall of ice water. Snow filled her nose, her mouth, her eyes. She crawled forward on her hands and knees across the vestibule floor, following the hemp line back to the outer stones. Her fingers found fabric first, a wool coat, soaked and frozen, then an arm, then a face. The man was Clara Baines' nephew. Jonah Baines, 19 years old, separated from Vale's men somewhere below the elbow when the storm made the road invisible. He had climbed toward the only thing he remembered from the ride up, a rock with a coach in it, and he had found the vestibule by falling into it. He was half conscious. His lips were blue. His fingers were white. Ragna dragged him through the entry gap by his collar. Snow and wind came with them. The buffalo robe blew inward. One lamp blew out. The temperature inside the coach collapsed. From 40 degrees to something Ragna could not read because the lamp that lit the thermometer was the lamp that had gone out. Eli screamed, not a word, a sound. The sound of a girl who had spent 7 days in a space that was barely keeping her alive and had just felt the cold come in. Ragna sealed the entry. She pressed the robe flat, weighted it, stacked stones against the base, and knelt on the bottom hem. She was soaked. Jonah was soaked. Everything was wet, and the one remaining lamp threw shadows that swung like pendulums across the walls. If you are invested in this story, stay with it, because the next choice decides whether the shelter saves them or becomes exactly what Voss warned it would be. Ragna's hands found the match tin in the dark. She had 7 matches. The tin was damp. She pulled one match free, cupped her hands around it, and tried to strike it against the tin lid. It hissed and died. She tried a second. It flared, caught a wet patch on her thumb, and went out. 5 matches left. The air was dropping fast. She could feel Eli shaking through the bunk frame. Ragna opened the brass mail pouch, the only waterproof container in the coach, and struck the 3rd match inside it, shielding the flame with brass on 3 sides. The match caught. She held it to the dead lamp's wick. The wick sputtered, smoked, and lit. 2 flames again. The mercury started its climb. 28, 30, 33, slowly, too slowly, but climbing. Ragna wrapped Jonah in the entry robe and packed Eli's buffalo robe tighter. She sat between them, one on each side, and waited for the thermometer to tell her they were not dying. 36, 38, 40. Near the lamp shelf, where the tin reflector bounced heat from both flames against the coach wall, the thermometer eventually read 70 degrees. Ragna stared at it. 70 degrees, in a box inside a rock, in a gale that was trying to tear the mountain apart. The number was local, a warm pocket no bigger than a bread oven, heated by two small flames in a sealed space backed by granite that released its stored warmth with geological patience. 2 feet from the lamp, the air was 43. At the entry, it was near freezing, but at the bunk, where Eli lay, it was warm enough to keep a fever from killing and cold enough to keep a healthy person awake. That was the design, not comfort, survival. Outside, the storm proved the alternative. Vale's men had made camp a mile below the elbow, sheltering behind a canvas wagon tilt stretched between two pines. It was the standard method, the method Voss had recommended, the method anyone with experience would have chosen. Canvas, windbreak, fire. The gale tore the canvas off its poles at 1 a.m. The fire blew out in the same gust. One mule tied to a pine froze standing up. The men retreated downhill in the dark, stumbling toward Camptonville, leaving their supplies where they lay. Voss and Aslak, at the station 7 miles east, tried to send a lantern team up the road when the storm first hit. They got 200 yards before the wind buried their lantern line under a drift, and they could no longer see the man in front of them. They turned back. Aslak's lungs, already weakened from years of stone dust and railroad smoke, took damage that night that would not heal. By morning, the gale had stacked snow 6 feet deep across the Hennis Pass Road. 2 freighters below Camptonville lost their roofs. A man named Dietrich, sheltering in a lean-to near the Middle Yuba Fork, was found frozen on the 3rd day after the storm, his fire pit still full of ash that the wind had scattered like seed. The storm did not last one night. It came in waves. A gale, then a lull that lasted 3 hours and felt like mercy, then a deeper cold that turned standing water to iron, then a second gale worse than the first. On the 3rd day, the wind died and the snow fell straight again, the mountain exhaling. And then it simply continued to snow, burying everything under a silence that was louder than the wind had been. Inside the coach cave, Ragna rationed. She did not keep both lamps lit. She burned one during the worst cold and the night hours. She turned it off at midday when the granite, warmed by the lamps overnight, held enough residual heat to keep the bunk above freezing. She melted snow in the tin dish. She fed Eli quinine tea and thin flour paste. She kept Jonah's hands wrapped and elevated and watched the color return to his fingers over 2 days. Not all fingers, but enough. She marked the thermometer readings on the wall each morning and each night. The numbers became a record, a proof, a conversation with herself. 12 outside, 43 inside, 58 by the bunk, 70 near the lamp. The numbers held, the granite held, the seals held, and then one did not. On the 4th night, the outer mud seam on the left wall cracked with a sound like a pistol shot. Ragna was asleep. The sound brought her upright. Cold air poured through the crack. Not a gust, but a steady stream, thin as a knife blade, aimed directly at the bunk. She scrambled to the wall. Her first instinct was mud. Slap mud over the crack, seal it, stop the bleeding. Her hands were reaching for the clay before she stopped. Aslak's voice, clear as the day he had said it. Surface mud freezes on the outside and shrinks. Wind finds the shrink crack. Wind enters. Wind peels the rest. Ragna dropped the mud. She grabbed a flat stone from the pile she kept near the entry, stones the size of her palm, selected for this purpose, though she had not known it until now. She drove the stone into the cracked seam with the heel of her hand. Then she packed moss behind it, pressing it deep with the tire iron. Then she sealed the back with clay. Stone first, moss second, clay behind. Wind hits stone. Wind cannot peel what it cannot lift. The stream of cold air stopped. The crack held. Ragna sat with her back against the sealed wall and pressed her torn hands against her thighs and breathed. The gale raged for 2 more days. The snow buried the vestibule entrance to the height of the stone curtain. Ragna kept the crawl gap clear by shoving snow outward with the shovel every 4 hours, a task that cost her heat and energy each time, but kept the air vent functional. On the 7th day, the wind stopped. The silence was so sudden that Eli asked if she had gone deaf. Ragna pushed through the crawl gap and stood on the elbow for the first time in a week. The world was white. Not beautiful, white. The color of nothing. The road was gone. The tree line was shortened by 4 feet of snow depth. The dead horses were invisible. The only proof that anything had ever existed on this grade was the dark seam in the granite face where a coach door had once been, and the faint smear of lamp smoke rising from a crack in the rock above, like the last breath of something alive. Ragna stood in the snow and tilted her face up. The sky was clear. The temperature was 9 degrees. She was alive. Her sister was alive. The boy who had stumbled into her door was alive. The coach was not a coffin. The gale had found it. It simply had not found a way in. Voss reached the cleft 9 days after the first gale, expecting bodies. He had spent those 9 days at his station with snow stacked to the window headers and a list in his head of the people he would need to account for when the road opened. Ragna Tvat and her sister were on that list. He had written them off on the second night when the temperature at his station dropped to 4 degrees and the wind bent his chimney pipe sideways. No canvas-roofed coach on an exposed grade survived that. He was sure. He was a man who had built snow sheds for the Central Pacific, and he was sure. He brought 2 men and a mule loaded with canvas for wrapping. Not rescue canvas, recovery canvas. The approach told him nothing. The elbow was buried. The dead horses were shapes under white. The coach was invisible. The cleft mouth was drifted over, and the granite face looked like unbroken rock with snow plastered across it. Then he heard tapping, not wind, not ice cracking, a rhythmic tapping, metal on stone, coming from inside the cliff. He stopped. His men stopped. The mule shifted its weight and blew steam. Voss walked to the rock face and knocked on the granite with his gloved fist. The tapping stopped. Then it answered him. 3 knocks from inside the stone, matching his rhythm. He dug. His men dug. They cleared the drift from the cleft mouth in 20 minutes and found the vestibule, the stone-walled space between the outer world and the coach entry. The buffalo robe hung in place, weighted and sealed. Voss pulled it aside. Ragna was sitting on the coach floor with the tire iron she had been tapping against the wall. Eli was upright on the bunk, wrapped in a robe, thinner than she should have been, but breathing without the wet rasp that fever puts in a chest. Jonah Baines sat in the vestibule with his hands bandaged, 2 fingers on his left hand black, but the rest pink and alive. The air inside the coach was warm enough that Voss's breath did not show when he ducked through the entry. He stood in the space, 8 feet by 5 feet, granite on 2 sides, wood on 2 sides, canvas above, sealed with mud and stone. And he turned slowly, the way a man turns inside a room he cannot explain. He removed his glove. He pressed his palm against the granite wall. The stone was not warm, but it was not the killing cold of the air outside. It held a middle temperature, a stubborn equilibrium that the wind had not been able to steal. He looked at the thermometer readings penciled on the coach wall. 12 outside, 29 sealed, 43 at the bunk, 58 by the lamp, 70 near the reflector. I called it a coffin, Voss said. He was looking at the wall, not at Ragna. It was, Ragna said, until the wind could not get in. Voss turned to face her. He was not a man who admitted error easily or often. He had spent 11 years on the railroad where admitting error meant admitting that the shed you built might collapse and kill the men inside it. But he was also a man who understood structures, and the structure he was standing inside was a structure that had done what he said it could not do. No, he said, I was wrong about the word. A coffin has no draft because the dead do not need one. You left just enough breath for the living. He sat down on the bunk beside Eli. He looked at the vent, the curved tin at the top of the canvas boot, the draw hole Ragna had burned in the lower panel. He looked at the seals, moss, stone, mud, layered and locked. He looked at the lamp shelf with its tin reflector. He looked at the charcoal marks on the granite, tracking the coach's entry into the cleft inch by inch. Then he did something Ragna had not expected. He pulled a notebook from his coat, the same notebook he used for road reports and mail tallies, and began to sketch. They came one at a time over the following weeks, as the road opened in short intervals between storms. They did not come to praise. They came to measure. Clara Baines arrived first, 3 days after Voss, carrying a notebook of her own and a cloth tape she had borrowed from the station. She measured the cleft mouth. She measured the coach width. She measured the gap between the stone and the wood at 6 points along both walls and recorded the thickness of the seal at each point. She tested the vent with a candle the way Aslak had taught Ragna, and she watched the flame lean outward, and she wrote the word draw in her notebook and underlined it twice. Clara did not say the method was brilliant. She said the method was specific. This works because this cleft is this shape and this coach is this width, and you sealed it this way, she said. What works somewhere else? It was the right question. Ragna had been thinking about it since the second night of the storm, when the seals held and the vent drew, and the numbers on the wall repeated themselves like a hymn she was learning by heart. The coach cave worked, but the coach cave was one coach in one cleft on one grade. The principle was bigger than the example. The principle is 3 things, Ragna told Clara. Stop the wind low, let the smoke leave high. Test before trusting. Clara wrote it down. She would carry those 3 sentences to Weber Lake Station and teach them to a family with 4 children who had been sheltering in a barn with gaps wide enough to see stars through. Harlan, Voss's teamster, came next. He brought his wife, a woman named Dora, who sewed canvas for freight tarps, and wanted to see how the coach roof sealed to the rock. She studied the junction and said the key was not the canvas. It was the stones capping the mud behind it. Canvas moves, Dora said. Stone does not. You anchored the moving thing to the still thing. She went home and sealed their cabin's worst wall the same way. Moss, stone, mud behind, and their fuel consumption dropped by 1/3 that winter. A road supervisor from Camptonville named Pettigrew rode up in late December, official and skeptical. He expected to find wreckage. He found Ragna dismantling the outer vestibule stones to improve drainage as snow melt began during a warm spell. He asked how the coach had survived intact. Ragna showed him the seals, the vent, the thermometer marks. He asked who had taught her. She said her father and a man named Aslak Moen. Pettigrew wrote both names down and then asked a question that mattered more than he knew. Can other people do this? Anyone can do this, Ragna said, if they test before trusting. The comparison numbers spread through the pass community because numbers do not require persuasion. Vale's canvas tilt, destroyed in one gale, supplies lost, 1 mule dead. Voss's line shack, roof collapsed under snow load, walls standing but useless. Dietrich's lean-to near the middle Yuba fork, total failure, 1 death. Ragna's coach cave, intact through a 60-day storm cycle, 3 occupants alive, less than a quart of kerosene consumed per night. No structural failure except 1 repairable seam crack. The numbers made the argument that Ragna never had to make. Vale heard the numbers. Vale understood the numbers. Vale hated the numbers. He rode up to the elbow in January during a brief road opening, and he did not bring a deputy notary this time. He brought a ledger. He stood in the vestibule and looked at the coach, still wedged in granite, still sealed, still functioning. And he said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "The coach is company property." Ragna was inside, resealing a section of the upper canvas where frost cycles had loosened the mud. She did not come out. "The debt is $32. Vale continued. "The coach is worth $80. The cargo is worth $46. You owe me more than you saved." "I saved 3 lives," Ragna said from inside. "What is your price for those?" Vale's jaw worked. He was not accustomed to losing arguments with people who owed him money. He was less accustomed to losing them when the entire past community had already decided he was wrong. The numbers on the coach wall, the thermometer readings, the fuel tallies, the survival count, had become a kind of verdict that his ledger could not overrule. He left without resolving the debt. The ledger stayed open. But the community's opinion had shifted, and Vale could feel it the way a man feels the current change in a river, not suddenly, but beneath everything. Spring came to Hennis Pass the way it always came, grudgingly, with false starts and reversals, and one last storm in March that dumped 3 feet of wet snow on a road that had just begun to show dirt. Ragna used the thaw to extract the coach from the cleft, a process that took 4 days with Voss's mule and Harlan's help, working the windlass in reverse. The coach emerged battered. One wall was permanently bowed from granite compression. The canvas roof had fused to the mud seals and tore when removed. The rear axle was bent, but the frame was sound, the floor was dry, and the iron hardware was intact. Vale's claim that the coach was ruined died the moment Harlan drove it on 3 wheels to Voss's station, where it sat in the yard like a monument to an argument already settled. Ragna did not rest. She did not celebrate. She began adapting. Aslak had returned to Voss's station in late February, thinner than when he had left, with a cough that came from deep in his chest and did not stop when the fits ended. His lungs had taken damage during the rescue attempt on the night of the first gale, the night he and Voss had tried to send a lantern team up the road and turned back when the wind buried their line. Stone dust and railroad smoke had weakened his lungs across decades. The storm finished what the years had started. He did not speak about it. He worked. Through April and May, Ragna and Aslak built together. They designed a stone-lined storm room behind Voss's station, not a coach cave, but a purpose-built shelter using the same principles. They found a south-facing rock wall, excavated a shallow alcove, and lined it with dry-stacked granite chinked with moss and clay. The walls were 18 inches thick. The roof was split cedar over log rafters, sealed with the same layered method. Moss, stone, clay behind. The vent was a curved tin channel, shaped like the one Aslak had taught Ragna to make, mounted at the roof peak where wind passing over the ridge would pull the draw. They argued about the floor. Aslak wanted packed earth. Ragna wanted raised planking. The disagreement was real, and it revealed different philosophies. Aslak trusted earth because earth held heat and dampened vibration. Ragna wanted planking because she had spent 60 days with Eli on a raised bunk and had learned that the difference between 2 feet off the ground and ground level was the difference between a living temperature and a dying one. Cold air sinks, Ragna said. If you sleep on the floor, you sleep in the coldest layer. Raised floors create gaps, Aslak said. Gaps create drafts. Drafts kill seals. Then seal the gaps. You cannot seal what you cannot reach. A raised floor hides its own failures. They compromised. The floor was packed earth with a raised sleeping platform at one end, planking on log supports, sealed at the wall junctions with the stone key method. The coldest air pooled at ground level near the entry. The sleeping platform sat 18 inches above it. When they tested the finished room with a lamp, the thermometer read 31 at the floor and 44 at the platform. Aslak looked at the numbers and nodded. He did not say Ragna was right. He said, "The numbers are right." Coming from Aslak, it was the same thing. They built 2 more structures that summer, a sealed coach body converted into a supply cache near the elbow, where travelers could store emergency provisions in a windproof shell, and a child shelter dug into a boulder field near Milton Creek, designed for families caught on the road between stations. Each one used the same principles. Each one was slightly different because every site was different, and Ragna had learned from the coach cave that the method was not a plan you followed but a set of questions you asked. Where does the wind come from? Where does the heat go? Where does the smoke leave? Test before trusting. Aslak's cough worsened through the summer. He did not stop working, but he stopped carrying. Ragna carried the stones. Aslak placed them. She mixed the clay. He tested the seals. Their partnership had shifted, not from teacher and student to equals, but from teacher and student as something without a clean name. He still corrected her. She still listened. But she also corrected him when his hands shook and he set a stone crooked, and he listened too. In September, Aslak told Ragna something he had not told anyone on the mountain. He had a daughter in Sacramento. They had not spoken in 11 years. The daughter had married a dry goods merchant and moved into a house with glass windows and a coal stove. And Aslak had said something about glass being a poor insulator, and the daughter had said something about stone masons not understanding how people wanted to live, and neither of them had found a way back from those sentences. She was right, Aslak said. He was sitting beside the stone-walled room he had helped design, watching the autumn light move across the granite. People do not want to live inside a principle. They want to live inside a home. The principle must serve the home. I forgot that. Ragna did not answer right away. She was thinking about Eli, who was healthy now and helping Clara at Weber Lake, and about the coach cave, which had been a principle made habitable by desperation. You did not forget it, she said. You taught it to me. The vent draws because you curve the tin. The bunk stays warm because you argued about the floor. Every lesson you gave me was about making the principle fit the person. Aslak looked at her. His eyes were the washed-out blue of high-altitude sky, and they were tired. Write to her for me, he said. Tell her the house with glass windows was a good idea. Ragna wrote the letter that evening. She does not know if it arrived. Aslak Moen died on the 23rd of October, 1873, seated near the stone-walled room behind Voss's station. His cough had become a sound like gravel shifting in a dry creek bed, and his breathing had thinned to something that barely moved the air. Ragna was beside him. Voss was inside the station, heating water he knew Aslak would not drink. Aslak's last words were not poetic. They were technical. Do not trust a wall because it is thick, he said. Trust it because you tested where it breathes. Ragna held his hand. It was a mason's hand, wide, scarred, with stone dust ground into the knuckles so deep it had become part of the skin. She held it until the warmth left it, and then she held it longer, because warmth leaving slowly was something she understood now, and she was not ready for the last of it to go. The granite above them held the afternoon sun the way granite holds everything, patiently, without opinion, releasing it back into the air so gradually that you could press your palm to the stone at dusk and still feel noon. The second winter came early. By November, the pass was locked again, and the community braced the way communities brace when they know what is coming, not with panic, but with the grim, steady work of people who have seen the thing before and survived it, and do not want to see it again. Ragna was not bracing, she was teaching. She ran the first winter preparation session at Voss's station in late October, 3 days before Aslak died. Families came from as far as Camptonville. They brought lanterns, canvas, shovels, and children. Ragna made each family test their own shelter plan with a candle and a thermometer before she would approve it. She did not approve plans that looked good. She approved plans that tested good. A wall can look sealed and breathe like a sieve, she told them. Hold the candle close. If the flame moves, the wind is there. Find it. Fix it. Then test again. Clara taught beside her. Ragna had insisted on it, not because she needed help, but because knowledge that lives in one person dies with that person, and she had just watched it almost die with Aslak. Clara taught the next family while Ragna watched, and Ragna corrected Clara the way Aslak had corrected Ragna, not with criticism, but with better questions. Did you test the lower seal or just the upper? Where does cold air collect? What happens if the wind shifts north? Voss, older now and walking with a heaviness that had not been there a year ago, told newcomers the same thing he told everyone. Do not ask whether your shelter is strong. Ask where the wind will steal from it. Then December brought the test that Ragna had not prepared for. The school sleigh carried 6 children and a driver named Fen Lockwood, who was 22 and had driven the route between Weber Lake Station and the Milton Creek Schoolhouse 11 times without incident. On December 14th, he loaded the children after the morning lessons, 4 boys and 2 girls, the oldest 12, the youngest 6, and started back toward the station on a road he could drive blindfolded. The storm hit the pass at 2 in the afternoon, with no warning that Lockwood recognized. The sky had been gray all day, but gray was normal. The wind had been steady from the west, but steady was manageable. What changed was the temperature. It dropped 14 degrees in 20 minutes, and the drop brought a wall of wind and snow that turned the road invisible. The sleigh overturned near a cut bank above Milton Creek. One runner caught a buried stump, and the whole rig tipped sideways, throwing children into the snow. The horse panicked, broke a trace, and bolted. Lockwood gathered the children against the cut bank and did the only thing he knew. He shouted for help into a storm that swallowed sound at 10 feet. Clara's nephew, Jonah, the same Jonah Baines whom Ragna had dragged from the vestibule 9 months earlier, heard the shouting. He was cutting firewood near the creek and barely caught the sound between gusts. He ran to the cut bank, counted 6 children and 1 driver, and ran to find Ragna. She was at Voss's station, 3/4 of a mile away. Jonah arrived with ice in his eyebrows and blood on his shins from falling twice on the frozen road. He said 6 children, overturned sleigh, cut bank above Milton Creek, driver with them, no shelter. Ragna did not hesitate, but she also did not run. She thought. The coach cave was too far. The route was blocked by fresh drifts, and the children could not walk that distance. The stone-walled room behind the station could hold 6 children, but the children were not at the station. They were at a cut bank, exposed, in a storm that was getting worse. She had to build a shelter where the children already were, with whatever she could find there, using the principles Aslak had taught her and the 60 days of knowledge she had earned inside a rock. Ragna grabbed a shovel, a coil of rope, 2 blankets, and a tin of matches. Clara, who had been at the station mending harness, grabbed a pot of boiled cloth strips, the paste she used for patching wagon canvas. Jonah carried the lantern. They reached the cut bank in 12 minutes. The children were huddled against the rock face, Lockwood's body blocking the wind. Two of the younger ones were crying. The oldest boy, 12, had his arms around the 6-year-old and was rocking her the way someone had taught him to rock a child in danger, slowly, steadily, as if calm could be manufactured. Ragna looked at the cut bank. It was not a cleft. It was a shallow overhang, granite, jutting 4 feet out from the hillside, with a concave space underneath roughly 8 feet wide and 3 feet deep. Not enough. But the shape was familiar. One side open to the wind, 3 sides stone. She did not explain. She ordered, "Boys, moss. Pull it from the trees, pull it from the rocks, pull it from the ground. Everything you can reach, pile it here." She pointed to the open face of the overhang. "Lockwood, the sleigh. Drag it to the opening. We use the bed as a wall. Clara, boil the cloth strips with snow. I need paste. Jonah, stones, flat ones. Every flat stone you can carry." They moved, not because they understood, but because Ragna's voice had the quality of a voice that has already survived the thing they were afraid of, and that quality does not require explanation. It requires obedience. The overturned sleigh bed became a wind wall. Lockwood and Jonah dragged it across the snow and wedged it against the open face of the overhang, reducing the exposed gap from 8 feet to 3. Ragna packed the remaining gap with moss, stones, and sled boards pried from the broken runner assembly. She sealed the joints with Clara's cloth paste, pressed behind flat stones. Not clay, not mud, but the same principle. Soft material behind hard material, wind hitting the hard surface and finding nothing to peel. The oldest boy watched Ragna work and asked the question that proved he was paying attention. "How do you know the smoke will go out and not come in?" Ragna stopped. She looked at him. He was 12 years old and shivering, and he had asked the right question. She handed him the lantern. "Hold the flame near the top of the wall. Tell me which way it leans." The boy held the lantern up. The flame leaned outward, drawn by the wind passing over the overhang's lip. "Outward," he said. "That is your answer," Ragna said. "The wind makes the draw. As long as the flame leans out, the smoke follows." She lit a small fire inside the shelter, not for warmth, because the space was too open for meaningful heat, but for the morale that fire gives to children who have been thrown from a sleigh into a storm. The smoke rose to the overhang ceiling and streamed outward through the gap at the top of the sledboard wall. The air inside the shelter was not warm, but the wind was gone. And without wind, the blankets worked. Without wind, 6 bodies in a small space raised the temperature enough that the shivering slowed and the crying stopped, and the youngest girl fell asleep against the 12-year-old boy's chest. They held the shelter for 4 hours until Voss arrived with mules and rope. No child lost fingers. No child lost toes. Lockwood lost the tip of his left ear to frostbite and did not notice until the next morning. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who understands that small knowledge can become shelter. The school sleigh rescue changed the community's relationship to Ragna in a way that the Coach Cave survival had not. The Coach Cave had been Ragna saving herself. The Cutbank shelter was Ragna saving other people's children. The first earned respect. The second earned trust. Families who had measured and nodded and gone home to try the method on their own now came to Ragna and asked her to inspect their work. She walked into root cellars, storm sheds, barn corners, and cabin walls, and she held a candle to every seam and told people what the flame told her. She was not gentle about it. "This seal will fail," she said to a man who had smeared mud over moss without stone. "You trusted the surface. The surface will freeze and crack, and the wind will enter, and you will wonder why it is cold." The man, a freighter named Polk, who had hauled goods over Hennis Pass for 6 years, bristled. "I have lived through more winters than you have lived years." "And how many of those winters did you spend inside a rock with the wind trying to find you?" Ragna asked. She was not unkind, but she did not retreat. "Test it. Hold the candle close. If the flame moves, fix it. If it does not move, you are right and I am wrong." Polk held the candle. The flame shuddered against the seal he had built. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "Show me." Ragna showed him. The knowledge spread the way useful knowledge spreads in isolated communities, not through announcement but through repetition. One family taught the next. Clara carried the method to Weber Lake. Harlan's wife Dora adapted the sealing technique for freight tarps and sold canvas wind walls to teamsters who had previously relied on luck and cursing. Voss incorporated the vent principle into his station design, admitting that the railroad had learned the same lesson at industrial scale. Sometimes survival meant guiding weather around you instead of fighting through it, but not everyone wanted the knowledge to spread freely. Vale had been quiet since January. He had watched the community shift around him the way a man watches a river change course, knowing he cannot stop it, wondering whether to move with it or be left on the dry bank. In March, he made his decision. He began offering what he called Tveit storm rooms as paid upgrades to his station leases. For $12, he would send men to seal a room using the Tveit method, moss, stone, clay, vent, and he would guarantee winter survivability. He used Ragna's name without her permission. He charged for knowledge she had given away for free. And the rooms his men built were poor copies, sealed tightly but vented badly, because Vale understood the selling point was warmth, and did not understand that warmth without breath was a box. Ragna heard about it from Clara, who heard about it from a family near Camptonville, whose Tveit storm room had filled with smoke on the first cold night and driven them coughing into the yard. The old threat had not disappeared. It had changed shape. Vale could not deny the method, so he tried to own it. He could not stop the knowledge, so he tried to sell it. And in selling a version he did not fully understand, he was turning the thing that saved lives into the thing that might take one. Ragna looked at Clara and said, "He will learn, or someone will teach him. Either way, the lesson comes." Clara asked, "What if the lesson comes too late?" Ragna did not answer. She was thinking about a man who sealed rooms without testing them, and about the winter that was already visible in the color of the sky. The winter of 1874 answered every question that argument could not. Vale's storm rooms, the ones his men built for $12 apiece, sealed tight and vented poorly, performed exactly as Ragna had feared. 3 families paid for the service. 2 of them discovered the problem on the same night in January, when a sustained gale from the northwest pushed smoke back through vents that had no draw curve and no lower relief hole. One family opened their door and let the cold in rather than choke. The other family, the Kesslers near Camptonville, tried to wait it out. Their youngest daughter inhaled enough smoke to damage her breathing for a year. Nobody died, but the margin was the width of a door hinge. One father who decided to open it instead of trusting the room he had paid for. The news traveled fast because bad news on a mountain pass always does. By the time it reached Voss's station, the story had acquired the weight of a verdict. Vale's rooms did not work, not because the principle was wrong, but because Vale had sold the parts of the principle he understood, the ceiling, the warmth, the promise, and skipped the part he did not, the breath. Ragnar heard the news from Clara and said nothing. She had been expecting it. She had also been expecting what came next, because she understood Vale well enough by now to know that a man who sells something he does not understand will eventually become its worst customer. It happened in February. A storm moved through the pass with the kind of wind that sounds personal, not weather, but intention. Vale was at his lower station, alone. His men had gone to Camptonville for supplies. He had a storm room, the best one his crew had built, the one he showed to potential buyers, the demonstration model. It was sealed tight. The walls were thick. The vent was a straight pipe through the roof with no curve, no draw angle, no lower relief. He lit his lamp and closed the door and waited for the storm to prove his investment. Within an hour, the wind shifted north and the straight vent became a funnel. Smoke from the lamp pooled against the ceiling, sank, and filled the room the way water fills a bowl. Vale doused the lamp. The room went dark and cold. He relit it 20 minutes later because the temperature had dropped to a point where cold was more dangerous than smoke. The smoke returned. He could not breathe, and he could not freeze. Those were his choices. The room he had built to sell, the room that carried Ragnar's name without her knowledge, was a box. Vale opened the door. The wind hit him with a force that drove him sideways into the doorframe. Snow and ice entered the room in a horizontal sheet. He stumbled out, pulled the door shut behind him, and walked a mile and a half to Voss's station through a gale that reduced visibility to the length of his own arm. He arrived at the station door with his eyes swollen shut from smoke exposure and ice crystals embedded in his beard. Ragnar was there. She had been staying at the station for a week, running winter preparation checks on the rooms Voss had built under her guidance. She heard the pounding on the door and opened it, and Vale fell into the room the way Jonah Baines had fallen into her vestibule a year ago, blind, frozen, and dependent on the shelter of someone he had tried to undermine. She did not turn him away. She did not lecture him. She led him to the bench beside the stove, heated water, and soaked cloth strips for his eyes. Clara helped. Voss watched from the doorway and said nothing, because what was happening did not require commentary. It required witness. Vale sat with wet cloth on his eyes for 2 hours. The room was quiet except for the fire, and the wind outside, and the sound of Ragnar wringing cloth. When the swelling eased enough for Vale to open his eyes, the first thing he saw was Ragnar's face, and the second thing he saw was the curved tin vent above Voss's stove, drawing smoke outward as the storm raged past the roof peak. "You know what went wrong," Ragnar said. It was not a question. "The vent," Vale said. His voice was hoarse from smoke. "What about the vent?" Vale was silent for a long time. He was a man who had spent his life understanding leverage and exchange, and he was sitting in a room where the only currency that mattered was knowledge he did not have. "It did not draw," he said. "Why?" "Because the pipe was straight. And there was no lower hole. The air had nowhere to come from. The smoke had nowhere to go." Ragnar nodded. She turned to the room. Voss was there. Clara was there. Harlan and Dora were there. Pettigrew, the road supervisor, had arrived that morning and was there. She spoke not to shame Vale, but to make the lesson public, because a lesson that stays private dies the next time someone builds a room without testing it. "Say it so they hear it," she said. Vale looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes, not anger, not gratitude, but the exhausted recognition of a man who has finally lost an argument he's been having with reality for 2 years. "A sealed room without breath is a box. Vale said. His voice carried across the room. Test before trusting. Every time. The words were Aslak's. Ragna heard them in a voice that was not Aslak's, and she held still for a moment because hearing a dead man's words in a living man's mouth is a specific kind of grief that does not have a season. Vale signed the papers the following week. He released Ragna's $32 debt. He signed over the damaged coach body, which had been sitting in Voss's yard since spring, and he withdrew the Tveit storm rooms from his station leases, not because Ragna demanded it, but because the community had already stopped buying them. He did not do these things from nobility. He did them because the Kessler family's daughter still coughed at night, and because Voss refused to witness any document that bore Vale's name until the debt was cleared, and because the road supervisor Pettigrew had written a report to the county that mentioned Vale's rooms by name and not favorably. The community had applied pressure the way wind applies pressure, steadily, from every direction, until the thing it pressed against either bent or broke. Vale bent. He signed the papers in Voss's station with Harlan and Clara as witnesses. He set down the pen and looked at Ragna and said, "You could have let me freeze." "No," Ragna said, "I could not." She meant it. Not because she was forgiving, and not because she was saintly. She meant it because a woman who had spent 60 days inside a rock, keeping 3 people alive, did not have it in her to let a 4th die on her doorstep, even if the 4th had tried to take everything she had built. Vale left Hennis Pass that spring. He sold his station lease to Voss and moved to Sacramento, where he brokered dry goods for the next decade. He never returned to the pass. He never spoke about the coach cave publicly. But Pettigrew's report survived, and in it, Vale's name appears once, in a sentence that reads, "The rooms built under Mr. Vale's direction were deficient in ventilation and were corrected at Miss Tveit's instruction." It was the smallest possible legacy. It was more than he deserved and less than he owed, and Ragna never mentioned it again. Jonah Baines came back, not immediately, not the next season. He returned to Hennis Pass in the autumn of 1876, 3 years after Ragna had dragged him from the vestibule with a rope around her waist and the wind trying to kill them both. He was 22 now. He had spent 2 years working as a carpenter's apprentice in Marysville, and he had returned because Clara had written him a letter that said Ragna needed help building a second station shelter before winter, and also because he had spent 2 years thinking about a woman who solved problems with candle flames and flat stones and had never once asked him for gratitude. He arrived at Voss's station with a tool chest, a bedroll, and a set of shutters he had built as a demonstration of his skill. The shutters were tight. The joints were clean. The wood was planed smooth and sealed with linseed oil. He presented them to Ragna the way a craftsman presents finished work, with pride and the expectation of approval. Ragna examined the shutters. She opened and closed them. She tested the hinges. She ran her finger along the joints. Then she said, "These will trap smoke." Jonah stared at her. "The fit is too tight," Ragna said. She held one shutter against the window frame. "No gap at the top, no draw space. If a lamp is burning inside and the door is closed, where does the air go?" "Through the chimney," Jonah said. "And if the chimney is blocked by snow? Or if the wind reverses the flue?" Jonah opened his mouth and closed it. He had built shutters that looked perfect. Ragna was telling him they could kill someone. "Cut a finger-width channel along the top rail," she said. "Shield it with a lip on the outside so rain does not enter. The air will draw through the channel the way it draws through a vent. The shutter stays closed. The room stays sealed, but it breathes." Jonah took the shutters back to his workbench. He cut the channel. He tested it with a candle. The flame leaned outward through the gap, steady and clean. He brought the modified shutters back. Ragna tested them again. The flame drew. She nodded. "Now they will work," she said. Jonah looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You are the most difficult person I have ever built anything for." "Good," Ragna said. "Build for easy people and someone dies in their sleep." Their courtship, if it could be called that, consisted of arguments about wood. Jonah built, Ragna tested. He learned to bring a candle to every joint before bringing the joint to Ragna. She learned that his instinct for tight construction was not vanity, but the same impulse that drove her, the need to make something that held. They disagreed about mortise depth and argued about hinge placement, and once spent an entire afternoon debating whether a door should swing inward or outward in a storm shelter. Jonah said inward, because an outward swinging door could be blocked by snow. Ragna said outward, because an inward swinging door could be forced open by wind. They compromised on a door that swung inward with a snow clearance hatch built into the lower panel, a solution neither of them would have reached alone. They married in the spring of 1878 at Voss's station, with Clara and Eli and Harlan and Dora in attendance. Voss served as witness. He shook Jonah's hand afterward and said, "She will test every wall you build for the rest of your life. If you can survive that, you can survive anything." Jonah said, "I already survived her vestibule. A wall is easier." The years after the marriage moved the way years move on a mountain, slowly in winter, quickly in summer, measured less by calendars than by snowfall and thaw. Ragna and Jonah built a cabin near the old Hennis Pass road, close enough to the elbow that Ragna could see the granite cleft from her kitchen window. They had 2 children, a boy named Aslak, born in 1879, and a girl named Marit, born in 1881. Eli married a school teacher from Downeyville and moved south, but she returned every autumn to help with the preparation sessions, bringing her own children to learn the candle test. By the 1880s, the winter preparation days had become a fixed event on the Hennis Pass calendar. Families gathered at Voss's station or at the Milton Creek shelter, bringing their tools and their questions. Ragna ran the sessions. Clara organized the materials. Jonah built demonstration models that families could take apart and study. The 12-year-old boy from the Cutbank Rescue Ice, the one who had asked about the smoke, was now a young man named Theo Lockwood, the driver's son, and he taught the youngest children how to hold a candle steady against a seal. Ragna did not charge. She had watched what charging did. It turned a principle into a product and a product into a shortcut, and shortcuts killed. The knowledge was free because free knowledge could not be controlled, and knowledge that could not be controlled could not be corrupted by someone who understood the price, but not the principle. Voss retired from the station in 1882, leaving it to Harlan. He stayed near the pass, living in the stone-walled room he and Ragna and Aslak had built behind the station, the room with the raised sleeping platform and the curved tin vent and the walls that held 44 degrees at bunk height when the world outside held 9. He told newcomers the same thing every year, and every year it meant more. Do not ask whether your shelter is strong. Ask where the wind will steal from it. He died in 1886, in the room he had doubted and then adopted and then lived in for 4 years. The thermometer on the wall still read 44. Clara Baines kept the teaching alive at Weber Lake until 1890, when the school there closed and the families moved to towns that had railroad connections. She left behind a slate board on the schoolhouse wall with 3 rules written in chalk that had been rewritten so many times the letters had worn grooves into the slate. Stop the wind low. Let smoke leave high. Test before trusting. The Hennis Pass road faded. The railroad killed the stagecoach routes. Freight went by rail. Passengers went by rail. The relay stations closed one by one, and the road that had carried gold rush traffic and Comstock freight and mountain mud wagons became a track through timber that fewer and fewer people traveled. Ragna stayed. She and Jonah kept the cabin near the elbow. She kept the original coach cave as a teaching site, bringing families there to see the charcoal marks on the granite and the pencil numbers on the coach wall. The coach itself aged, wheelless now, silver gray with weather, its canvas long gone, its panels warped but still seated in the cleft, where Ragna had wedged them inch by inch with a windlass and torn hands and the kind of patience that is not patience at all, but the refusal to accept that the thing cannot be done. She did not become famous. She did not become a legend in the way that frontier stories create legends, larger than life simplified into parable. She became something quieter and more useful. She became the person you talked to before winter, the person who made you hold a candle to your wall and admit what the flame told you, the person who had survived not because she was stronger than the cold, but because she had understood in a granite notch on the worst road in the Sierra that survival was not about keeping the cold out. It was about keeping the warmth in. Ragna Tveit died in 1909 in the cabin near the Hennis Pass Road at the age of 60. Above her stove hung a curved piece of tin, Aslak Moen's original vent shield, salvaged from the coach cave 20 years earlier, still drawing smoke outward as the wind passed over the roof. Her last recorded words, spoken to Marit the night before, were a complaint that Jonah had sealed the bedroom window too tightly and the room was not drawing properly. She was testing until the end. Within 3 winters of the first storm, at least 9 families along the Hennis Pass Road had adopted some version of Ragna's method. Not all of them were coach caves. Most were not. They were sealed stone rooms, wind-shielded root cellars, bark-lined overhangs, and cabin walls rebuilt with moss and stone behind the mud. What they shared was not a design, but a discipline. Find where the wind steals, stop it. Leave the room enough breath to live, and never trust a seal you have not tested with a flame. Clara's schoolhouse at Weber Lake kept the slate board on the wall until the building was torn down in 1893. The grooves in the slate were deep enough that the man who removed the board ran his thumb across them and asked what had been written there so many times. Ragna Tveit lived out her years near the old road. Later travelers knew her less as the woman in the coach, and more as the woman who would not let you close a window without checking the draw. She kept the tin thermometer from the coach cave on a nail beside her door. It no longer worked. The mercury had separated somewhere around 1885, but she kept it because the numbers had been her first proof, and first proof is something you do not throw away even when better proof has come. On the granite bend above Milton Creek, the coach remains. It is old now, wheelless, silvered by weather, its panels warped and split, but still wedged in the cleft where a 23-year-old woman drove them with a windlass made of harness leather and a fir branch. Snow crosses the rock face every winter and misses the dark seam where the door used to be. Inside on the wall, the pencil marks have faded but not disappeared. 12 outside, 43 inside, 58 by the bunk, 70 near the lamp. The numbers do not argue. They do not persuade. They record. Matthew Voss stood on this ground in November of 1872 and told Ragna Tveit that her coach was a coffin once the gale found it. He was right about one thing. The gale did find the coach. It found it that first midnight, when the wind hit the rock face with a sound like a train, and the snow traveled sideways, and the temperature dropped to 9 degrees, and a man in a lean-to by the river froze beside a fire that the wind had scattered like ash. The gale found the coach. It pressed against the granite. It screamed over the rock. It drove snow past the cleft mouth in a horizontal river of white. It never found a way in.